What's up, nerds, and welcome to What's So Good About, a segment where we talk about a game and what's so good about it. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite beat-em-ups, and that is Streets of Rage. When Streets of Rage is mentioned, usually people talk about the second game and how that is their favorite and the best, but there's a lot of good things in the first one as well that aren't really mentioned as much, so let's go over that. And the first thing that makes this game so good is that it was built for a console. Now that might seem like a strange thing to say about a game because yeah, so many games are built for the consoles they're made for, but with beat 'em ups it's a different story because so many of them first came out in the arcade. So many cabinets were built with the expectation for you to try again and again and put in those quarters, and because of that, arcade games aren't really known for being the most fair or balanced when it comes to gameplay. There are so few arcade games where you can put in one quarter and beat it, especially on your first try. Streets of Rage was built for the Sega Genesis, and I think this benefited the gameplay because the idea of you dying and having to put a quarter in is out of the developers' minds. It feels like there's less cheat deaths and ways to get out of scenarios that in a lot of other beat 'em up games you just wouldn't be able to. It's not a cakewalk by any stretch of the imagination, but there are strategies for about every villain that you come across, and in turn that gives Streets of Rage a little bit more depth than the average beat 'em up in the genre. Another struggle a lot of developers ran into was when they were making the console versions of these arcade games, they were trying to make the graphics look as comparable as possible. To get those graphics looking as good as they could, sometimes sacrifices in other areas of the game were made. Most notably, some of the biggest beat 'em up titles were only one player on their console systems. For most people, playing a beat 'em up with somebody else is the preferred beat 'em up experience. And while Streets of Rage was by no means the only beat 'em up that was multiplayer, it actually provided some legit competition for some of the arcade beat 'em ups at the time. The next thing that's so good about this game is the amazing soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. He's worked on a lot of titles like The Revenge of Shinobi, the Game Gear version of Sonic the Hedgehog, and ActRaiser to name a few. This is the only Streets of Rage game that he's worked on entirely by himself, and I think because of that, it sounds the most consistent to me. Now, all the Streets of Rage soundtracks are amazing and are super influential to electronic music, but this one in particular is the most melodic to me. It's pretty amazing how well the Sega Genesis sound chip was used in this case. It doesn't sound like he's working with limitations, but knowing that he was, it makes it even more impressive. When I think about it too, it's not really a style that I would normally associate with like a beat 'em up game. Usually you think of like rock or something like that, but it works really, really well and it fits the series and really gave it an identity. The fact that songwriters outside of the video game industry cite Yuzo Koshiro and Streets of Rage as making a huge impact on them says a lot about the quality of the soundtrack. This kind of goes hand in hand with the soundtrack, but another thing that's so good about this game is the overall city and art design. It's kind of cliche to say this, but the city does have its own identity and it's almost kind of its own character. It's this kind of weird mix between LA, New York, and Miami. It's definitely reminiscent of the idealized late 80s, early 90s kind of city you would see in movies, and even though the city's going to hell, it has all these bright colors and looks kind of beautiful. I love that the cityscape is almost always in the back of each stage and kind of reminds you what you're fighting for. That neon aesthetic from the first stage has carried over and has become really iconic of the series in every Streets of Rage title since. Next up are the specials. Now this is something that hasn't happened again since the latest title, Streets of Rage 4, but that is the return of the police squad car. Your special from Streets of Rage 1 is your buddy in a squad car coming with a big bazooka and blowing away everybody on screen. If you are the second player, he comes with a minigun and takes everyone out. It's over the top and nuts and cinematic, but it's awesome, and it kind of has a suspension of disbelief because what's he doing when he's not driving the car? Why doesn't he come help you out then? But it doesn't matter because it's so cool and crazy. Most of the later games, they just had a special move that you would do, like a big fire punch or something like that, which is cool. Definitely, it's cool, but it's not as effective as a cop with a minigun coming out and taking out all your enemies. Another thing that made this game so good was on the higher difficulties, you had an insane amount of enemies on the screen at one time. This kind of goes hand in hand what we were talking about earlier. Sometimes when developers would make these games and the graphics really detailed, there was a limited number of enemies you could have on the screen at one time. Streets of Rage on the hardest difficulty goes nuts with this. There's so many characters on the screen at one time. It becomes super overwhelming but really fun and really enjoyable. One of the most satisfying things to do is when there's a horde of enemies coming at you, you can jump kick and take them all out. It only makes sense in beat 'em up physics, but it is endlessly entertaining to do that. And lastly, I want to talk about something that's a minor spoiler, so if you haven't played the game before, you might not want to watch this part, but that is the alternate endings of Streets of Rage. If you're playing with somebody else and you get to the end with Mr. X, he will give you the option of being his right-hand man. If you're both good protagonists, he will refuse him and you'll have the normal ending after you defeat him, but if one of you decides you do want to take over his syndicate and the other doesn't, you will battle to the death. Depending on who you're playing with, this could get dark real soon and maybe end some friendships. But it will also give you a different ending depending on who wins this death battle. It's something really small but really cool that they added in. So if I was asked what's so good about the original Streets of Rage, I would say that it was built for that console and it really took advantage of everything it had to offer. It has an amazing electronic soundtrack. The city and art design really identify the series and the whole aesthetic. The specials are over the top and really crazy, but really satisfying and fun. A large number of enemies on the screen at one time, and then the game offers some alternate endings. But I'm curious, what do you guys think is so good about Streets of Rage, and what is your favorite Streets of Rage title in the series? And with that, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Noisy Pixels run by a group of gamers who work hard to bring you news, reviews, previews, and more. Please subscribe to keep up with all our future content.